For thousands of years, before any European ships ever reached these shores, vast and complex civilizations thrived across the Americas. This isn't just a story of the past, it's a living history that continues to shape our world today. Let's explore the deep and often misunderstood story of the indigenous peoples of America. Most scientists agree that the first peoples of the Americas migrated from Asia across a land bridge called Beringia, which once connected Siberia and Alaska. This was not a single event, but a series of migrations that began as far back as 30,000 years ago. These early peoples weren't just wandering hunters, they were pioneers, explorers adapting to new and diverse environments. From the frigid Arctic to the humid Amazon rainforest, they developed an incredible variety of cultures, languages, and societies. Think about it. Before 1492, the Americas were home to an estimated 50 to 100 million people, speaking over 2,000 distinct languages. This was a continent buzzing with life and innovation. In North America, you had the ancestral Pueblones in the southwest, building stunning cliff dwellings, like those at Mesa Verde. They were master architects and astronomers, creating complex societies in a challenging desert landscape. Further east, along the Mississippi River, the city of Cahokia flourished. At its peak, around the year 1250, it was larger than London at the time, with massive earthen mounds, a bustling trade network, and a sophisticated social structure. It was a true metropolis of the ancient world. The Great Plains were home to numerous nations, many of whom developed a deep, symbiotic relationship with the bison herds, which provided food, shelter, and spiritual sustenance. In the northeast, powerful confederacies, like the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois, formed sophisticated political alliances, governing themselves through democratic principles that some historians believe influenced the framers of the U.S. Constitution down in Mesoamerica. Civilizations like the Maya developed intricate writing systems, advanced mathematics, incredibly accurate calendars. Their cities, with towering pyramids and observatories, were centers of science and art. The Aztec Empire, with its magnificent capital Tenochtitlan, built on an island in a lake, was a marvel of engineering and political power, controlling a vast territory through tribute and trade. And in South America, the Inca Empire created the largest empire in the Pre-Columbian Americas. They built an astonishing network of roads, spanning thousands of miles through the Andes Mountains, developed unique agricultural techniques like terrace farming, and managed a complex society without a traditional writing system, using a system of knotted cords, called quipu, to keep records. Each of these societies had its own unique cosmology, its own understanding of the world, and its own relationship with the land. The land wasn't just a resource to be exploited, it was a relative, a sacred entity to be respected and cared for. This worldview was fundamentally different from the one that would soon arrive from across the Atlantic. The year 1492 marks a turning point, not just for the Americas, but for the entire world. The arrival of Christopher Columbus and subsequent European colonizers unleashed a cataclysmic series of events. This encounter is often called the Columbian Exchange, a term that sounds neutral. But the reality was devastating for indigenous peoples. The most immediate and deadly impact came from diseases. Smallpox, measles, influenzalises that were common in Europe were completely unknown in the Americas. Indigenous people had no immunity. Epidemics swept through communities with terrifying speed and ferocity, wiping out entire villages and destabilizing complex societies. Some estimates suggest that up to 90% of the indigenous population perished from disease in the first century after contact. It was one of the greatest demographic disasters in human history. But disease was only part of the story. European arrival also brought violence and warfare on an unprecedented scale. Driven by a desire for gold, land, and resources, colonizers waged brutal campaigns against indigenous nations. The Spanish conquistadors, with their steel weapons, armor, and horses, toppled the Aztec and Inca empires. This violence wasn't just a byproduct of conquest, it was a deliberate tool of subjugation. The very philosophy of colonization was based on the idea of superiority. Europeans often viewed indigenous peoples as savages or heathens, justifying their enslavement and the seizure of their lands. Legal and religious doctrines, like the doctrine of discovery, were created to give a veneer of legitimacy to this dispossession. This ideology dehumanized indigenous peoples, making it easier to commit atrocities against them. As European colonies grew, so did the pressure on indigenous lands. The founding of the United States brought a new, systematic approach to this dispossession. The official policy of the U.S. government became one of removal. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed by President Andrew Jackson, forced tens of thousands of people from the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole nations off their ancestral lands in the southeast. They were forced to march west on a journey that became known as the Trail of Tears. Thousands died from disease, starvation, and exposure. It was an act of ethnic cleansing, designed to open up land for white settlement and cotton plantations. This wasn't an isolated incident. Throughout the 19th century, the U.S. government signed hundreds of treaties with indigenous nations, promising them land and protection. Almost all of these treaties were eventually broken. The U.S. pursued a policy of manifest destiny, the belief that the country was divinely ordained to expand across the continent. This expansion led to a series of brutal conflicts known as the Indian Wars. Battles like the Sand Creek Massacre and the Wounded Knee Massacre were not battles in the traditional sense. They were mass killings of men, women, and children. The goal was to break the resistance of Plains nations and force them onto reservations. Reservations were small, often barren parcels of land designated for indigenous peoples. Confining once nomadic or wide-ranging peoples to these areas destroyed their traditional economies and ways of life. The U.S. government also deliberately targeted the bison, the lifeblood of the Plains tribes. By encouraging the slaughter of millions of bison, the government aimed to starve indigenous peoples into submission. By the late 19th century, the physical conquest was largely complete. The next phase of the assault was cultural. The U.S. government implemented policies of forced assimilation, aimed at erasing indigenous cultures, languages, and spiritual beliefs. The motto was "Kill the Indian, save the man." A key part of this strategy was the creation of residential boarding schools. Indigenous children were forcibly taken from their families and sent to these schools, often hundreds of miles away. They were forbidden from speaking their native languages or practicing their cultural traditions. They were forced to cut their hair, wear military-style uniforms, and adopt Christianity. The conditions were often harsh, and abuse was rampant. The goal was to sever the connection between generations and destroy the cultural fabric of indigenous communities. The trauma inflicted by these schools continues to affect families and communities to this day. The Dawes Act of 1887 was another tool of assimilation. It broke up communally owned reservation lands into individual plots, which were then allotted to individual families. The idea was to turn indigenous people into American-style farmers, but the policy was a disaster. Much of the land was unsuitable for farming, and the surplus land was sold off to white settlers. In the decades after the Dawes Act, indigenous nations lost another 90 million acres of their land-based territory, roughly the size of Montana. But this is not just a story of victimization. Throughout this entire period, indigenous peoples resisted. They fought back on the battlefield, through diplomacy, in the courts, and through the simple, powerful act of cultural survival. They held on to their languages, their ceremonies, and their stories, often in secret. Leaders like Tecumseh, Crazy Horse, and Geronimo organized military resistance. Others, like Sarah Winmucker and Zitkalawua, fought for their people's rights through writing and activism. The 20th century saw a slow but determined shift towards self-determination. In 1924, indigenous people were finally granted U.S. citizenship. The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 ended the disastrous allotment policy and encouraged tribal self-government. But progress was not linear. The 1950s brought the termination era, a disastrous policy that sought to terminate the federal government's relationship with certain tribes, effectively ending their sovereign status and leading to further land loss and economic hardship. Then, starting in the 1960s and 70s, a powerful wave of indigenous activism, often called the Red Power movement, emerged. Inspired by the civil rights movement, activists from groups like the American Indian Movement, or AIM, demanded treaty rights, sovereignty, and an end to systemic racism. Events like the occupation of Alcatraz in 1969 and the standoff at Wounded Knee in 1973 brought national attention to the plight of indigenous peoples and their fight for justice. This activism led to significant policy changes, like the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act of 1975, which gave tribes more control over their own affairs, including their schools and social programs. Today, there are 574 federally recognized tribal nations in the United States, each with its own government, laws, and culture. indigenous communities are still grappling with the legacies of colonization, poverty, health disparities, and the ongoing fight to protect their land and water. But they are also experiencing a powerful cultural renaissance. There is a resurgence of indigenous languages, a revitalization of traditional practices, and a growing movement of artists, scholars, and activists who are telling their own stories and shaping their own futures. From the Standing Rock protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline to the Land Back movement, which seeks the return of stolen lands, indigenous peoples continue to be at the forefront of environmental protection and social justice movements. They are reminding us all that their history is not confined to the past. It is a living, breathing story of resilience, survival, and a profound connection to this land we all call home. Understanding this history is essential for understanding America itself. Thank you for watching. If you found this video informative, please give it a like, subscribe for more content, and share your thoughts in the comments below.